Well, can you be a science-loving, fact-finding, Bible-believing Christian? Can you believe in the Big Bang and creation? How does someone concerned with mathematics and picturable data also embrace the unknown surrounding God? We're going to talk about some of that today. Welcome back to the Finding Something Real podcast. This is your host, Janell Wood. And I am so excited because we have been talking with young women about their questions. And you may even identify with some of those questions. Maybe you're someone with serious doubts about Christianity, or you may love someone in your life with questions, or frankly, you may just have some questions of your own. And I get that. And I've been in all of those places. Like I said, I'm your host, Janell Wood, and I love to talk with young people about their questions. You are listening in for season 7, where we invite different young women from different backgrounds to come and share their stories and address their tough questions about God and Christianity. And we then invite Christian guests to join us for follow-up conversations. Today's episode is dedicated to my friend and co-host, Lizzy. Lizzy shared about her love of science and math. And in our first conversation together, she shared some interesting thoughts that she had about the Big Bang Theory. You can listen to that right here. But anyway, in there, he talks about exactly what you're talking about, that it would take impossible odds. And he goes through those odds of what it would take for all of that to happen by accident. In fact, I don't know if they teach you this in school, but Albert Einstein didn't like the idea of a beginning to the universe, because to say that everything came from one single beginning, like what you're talking about, in an instant, a Big Bang, sounded way too much like God.
I was just thinking about this, and I don't know, did God just exist, and was he just like having tea parties with like his angels, and then one day it was just like, I'm bored and need like a reality TV show but make it real, and just was like, let's create some people? I don't know. This is like, he's always existed, right? That's like what people are claiming, right? So like, why did he create Earth?
Unfortunately, Lizzy had a college class today and isn't available for this recording, but I did talk to her yesterday and she was super excited about the topic. She's sad to miss today's special guest. Our guest today is Melissa Cain Travis. Melissa is a science and religion scholar with a special interest in the intersection of science and Christianity in the Western tradition. She earned a PhD in humanities with a philosophy concentration from Faulkner University, where her dissertation research focused on the natural philosophy and natural theology of Johannes Kepler. We'll have to ask her about that. She is the author of Thinking God's Thoughts, Johannes Kepler, and the Miracle of Cosmic Comprehensibility, Science and the Mind of the Maker, What the Conversation Between Faith and Science Reveals About God, and a contributing author for The Story of the Cosmos, How the Heavens Declare the Glory of God. She is a fellow of the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture, a course director or course instructor at discoveryu.org, and a member of the core writing team for the Worldview Bulletin and Shadowlands Dispatch. She regularly lectures at conferences, universities, classical schools, and churches around the country. Melissa Cain Travis, welcome to the Finding Something Real podcast.
This is going to be so much fun. Thank you for having me.
What a bio. Tell me, okay, I have to know, Johannes Kepler, I had to look that up yesterday on Wikipedia when I was writing all this out because the name was familiar, but I will be honest with my ignorance and say I could not remember. Tell me your fascination with that particular person and what he did to contribute to science and the whole conversation around God and faith and
Sure.
science.
When I was a master's student at Biola University, I was studying for my degree in science and religion. The class that captivated me most was called Historical Perspectives on Science and Religion. And it was in that class that I got my first graduate level education in the history of science, but also in the history surrounding the different points of intersection between Christian doctrine and scientific progress. When we got to the topic of the scientific revolution, I was really wonderstruck, I guess is the best way to describe it, by the fact that the giants of the scientific revolution were also Christians. Some of them were actually quite devout Christians. During a time when it was not the easiest thing in the world to be someone of the Protestant tradition like Johannes Kepler was. So Kepler was a Lutheran Christian, And I would argue, and have argued extensively in a few different places, that he was the most important figure of the scientific revolution. One of the reasons for that is that he was the mathematician / astronomer who transitioned the study of the heavens from the ancient methods of astronomy, if you will, to a true mathematical astronomical physics. And he did this by applying mathematics to the study of the heavens and to records of stellar observations and things of that nature in a way that no one before him had done. He was fascinated with astronomy and other forms of mathematics. He even believed that the mathematical principles at work in musical harmony could somehow explain various natural phenomena to us. Things like the distances between the planetary orbits and why we have the number of planets that we have in our solar system. Of course, back then it was the universe, because they weren't aware of anything beyond our little corner of this brain cosmos. So in reading about Johannes Kepler, of course, we came to the famous quote where that's often paraphrased to say, when we do science, we are thinking God's thoughts after him. And I could not get that statement out of my head. And it remained there throughout the rest of graduate school. And then as I started thinking about what kind of PhD studies I might want to do, I kept coming back to that idea that when we explore God's creation, we're gaining glimpses into the very mind of God for his rational and beautiful plan for creation before it even came about. And so I decided that I would eventually write my dissertation on Johannes Kepler. And I spent my first several years in my PhD program doing all the groundwork research for that. And the more I learned, the more I realized that this idea of Kepler's had a rich and very long intellectual pedigree that could even be traced back to pre-Socratic philosophers long before the birth of Jesus. And that was thrilling to me. And I just fell deeper and deeper in love with the intersection of history, philosophy, science, and theology. And that's why I devoted my dissertation to Johannes Kepler's natural theology. And for listeners who aren't familiar with that phrase, this is the idea that we can learn something about the existence and attributes of God by studying the things that he has made. And also Johannes Kepler's natural philosophy. So that's the phrase that was used to describe the study of nature before we started calling it natural science. And the reason I use the old phrase is because it was far more interdisciplinary and it was a far richer understanding of what it is we're witnessing when we study nature and how we should understand fundamental truths about the source of all things and the design of all things. And one of our big missions at Discovery Institute, this is a little side note, is that we believe that human flourishing and cultural renewal are deeply rooted in the fundamental truth that mind and design are the ultimate foundation of the study of nature and the study of human beings even, rather than blind material processes. So that's my... Well, I tried to be short. I tried to give you a short explanation of why I love Johannes Kepler so much. But the end of the story, well, not really the end of the story, but the way the story progressed from that point was putting Johannes Kepler into conversation with contemporary philosophers and scientists to see how his ideas have withstood the test of time particularly in terms of the advancement of the natural sciences, but also in terms of the advancement of specialty branches of philosophy, such as the philosophy of mind, the metaphysics of abstract objects. And I know that sounds very complicated. Basically, that's a little sub-branch of philosophy that's interested in the question, are things like numbers and laws of logic and mathematical operations, are these things that truly exist in the real world? Or are they just ways that we talk about certain attributes of things that are real? So put Kepler in conversation with what a lot of contemporary scholars have to say about those things. And I am convinced that his arguments hold up even more beautifully today than they even did during his time. And that says a lot about his arguments for a creator in whose image we're made.
Wow. What years was he alive?
So Johannes Kepler was born in the late 16th century, and he died in 1630. He died quite young. He had not quite reached his 60th birthday.
Okay. So we're talking about 400 years ago. And it's interesting because have you seen J. Warner Wallace? He's been on this podcast. He talked to one of my co-hosts in the last series I did, my co-host Noelle. Jim Wallace does this amazing presentation based on his book, Person of Interest. Have you seen this?
I've seen the book, yes.
Okay. Well, his presentation is amazing because, he does all his own graphics and art because he's an artist and stuff. But he goes through and he does all of this brief but very compelling history of all these people who, through the sciences and mathematics and all these different things, all were, focused on God is who he says he is. Therefore, I am who he says I am. And I'm going to, search out these things. I'm going to look for math and, his creation. And oh my goodness, I found it. And it was their pursuit of God that led them deeper into the sciences and, discovering all of these amazing things, not the lack of it. And it just is really beautiful. I'm sure he mentioned Johannes Kepler in there. But one of the best presentations, in fact, if you want, we can link it in the show notes, a YouTube video of him giving that presentation. The book is excellent as well. But anyway, what you're saying reminds me of that. And it's kind of a pity because we'll talk about this in a minute, but so many people today, especially in our, culture, think that if you are a scientist or if you really believe in mathematics or science, you have to drop your love of God at the door. And I'm just wondering, have you always loved science? Did you always know that that was something you were passionate about?
For sure. Probably my earliest memory of really loving all things science goes back to kindergarten. My teacher's name was Miss McIntosh. And my favorite days in Mrs. McIntosh's class were when we got to watch, well, this is going to date me and reveal how old I actually am, but we would watch film strips. Do you remember film strips in elementary school? Yeah. And when we would get to watch something on like plate tectonics or dinosaurs or whatever, those were my favorite times in class. So I knew very early, from at least the age of 5, that I loved all things science. And then I went on to major in biology as an undergrad. And I spent 5 years after graduating with my degree in biology in the field of biotechnology. So I was particularly interested in genetics. And I worked for a company that designed what are called knockout mice. And essentially what that means is we would manipulate the genome of these mice such that they would be missing a gene at birth. And we would study them and see what went wrong as a result. And that would tell us something about the function of the gene. And the knockout mice were then used to develop therapies for disorders related to what we were observing in the mice. And so during my time there, they developed a successful medication for cardiovascular disease. And they were doing studies on obesity, all sorts of things just to help improve, the human condition in this fallen world. And I loved my time in the lab. It was a fascinating and intellectually fulfilling 5 years of my life. But in another respect, it was also a discouraging and sometimes humiliating time in my life as a Christian, because here I was sitting at a lab bench all day, every day, and I had colleagues with very high credentials in the natural sciences. I mean, I was surrounded by PhDs, and here I am with my bachelor's degree in biology. And I knew just from casual conversation over the first few months there that some of these scientists were not believers. And I felt so burdened about that. And I started having spiritual conversations with them and asking them questions about ultimate origins, etc. And what I discovered about myself was that the kinds of questions that would come up within just a few minutes were not questions that I had good answers to. And I felt like a failure as an evangelist. And my older son, he'll be 21 next month. My older son was born, and I became a stay-at-home mom. And I still could not get away from this sense of frustration that here I was a Christian who loved the sciences, and I could not have really good conversations with a non-believer about these topics.
I want to know what kind of questions they were asking.
Well, really, how do you believe the miraculous content of the Bible and also love science? Or aren't all Christians just evolution deniers? And how do you reconcile the theory of evolution with Christianity? And then they would bring up stories from the Old Testament, like Jonah and the great fish. And do you really believe that happened? I mean, you're a rational human being. How can you suggest that? Those sorts of things.
Melissa, had you grown up in a Christian home? Had you always believed it? Had it ever been a questioning thing for you? Or did you just take it on faith up until that point?
So my father is a Baptist pastor. So I was a preacher's kid. He actually did not begin his career as a pastor until I was 12, but I was in a Christian home from my earliest memory. And so a lot of it was don't question the teachings of the Bible type stuff. So I grew up in the deep rural South, and there just wasn't, in my world at least, there wasn't any concept of an intellectually based belief in the teachings of Christianity. So when I was probably 11th grade, 10th or 11th grade, it was the first time I was exposed to origins topics in biology class. And the one and only time I ever asked a question about this topic at church, I was shut down immediately and just told to believe what Scripture teaches and not to believe the lies of Darwinism. And that was all I got. And I was actually made to feel sort of ashamed for even having the question. And so from that point forward, basically what I did was I compartmentalized my intellectual life. So I believed that Christianity was objectively true. I never heard the word apologetics. I didn't know there was any such thing as offering a real defense of the faith. I just thought that these were two areas of reality that just shouldn't touch one another. And if I was going to be able to really love both of them. And so when I went through my undergraduate degree in biology, I was actually at a conservative Christian private university. And the interesting thing about that is I was able to do an entire 4-year degree in biology without ever discussing the intersection of science and faith with any professor during my entire time there. When I graduated, I was still very compartmentalized. And I just made the assumption that you could fully trust all the words coming out of the world of the scientific enterprise, but then also you could trust the things that you were taught at church. And I was convinced that, you got quote unquote gospel truth from both domains. And that required some compartmentalization, and it required living in a lot of tension and even some denial about inherent conflict between ideas on both sides, for lack of a better way to describe that. And so when I entered the workforce, this was before I did my master's in science and religion, I just wasn't prepared because I'd not been exposed to that kind of conversation. And it wasn't until I was 23 that I ever heard the word apologetics for the first time in my life.
You mentioned that you wanted to share your faith with the other scientists you were working with, that you felt like, oh, I want to share this. Was that part of your DNA as well? You loved science from an early age, but did you love sharing Jesus with people at an early age? Was that something that comes naturally to you as well?
I wouldn't say it came naturally to me. The situation was I had really grown up in a bubble. Although I did public school K through 12, being in the rural South back in the 70s and 80s, everybody was a Christian, or at least everybody thought they were, if they weren't really, you know what I mean? And so you never had your beliefs challenged in that regard. And so when I first entered the workforce, and there's a parallel story that goes along with this involving a move from rural North Carolina to the city of Houston and working for a lab in the middle of the medical center in downtown Houston, Texas. Just fish out of water story all the way around. And so those kinds of questions caught me off guard in the worst possible way. But I wouldn't say I had this just natural passion for evangelizing the people that I was talking with. It would be better described as a sense of intense urgency out of fear for their souls. Like I wanted them to know Jesus, and I wanted them to understand how important it was for them to know Jesus. And then they were asking me questions that I couldn't answer. And the way I interpreted that internally was, I am failing the Lord because I don't know what to say. And I know there have to be good things to say in response. I just don't know them. And why don't I know them? And so that brings me back around to becoming a new mom, staying at home, and having the time to do a lot of self-study in the intersection of science and Christianity, and discovering this whole world of science and religion and philosophy of religion, and that term apologetics that I started, a field that I started studying for the very first time on my own. And it was, so that would have been in 2003. And then it was 2009 when I discovered that I could actually do a graduate degree in science and religion. And that was a very fun Holy Spirit story, because the way I learned about the existence of the field in terms of academia was I had gotten an issue of Christianity Today magazine in the mail, and I was flipping through it one day, and there was this quarter-page ad on one of the pages that talked about the Science and Religion Master's Program at Biola University. I'd never heard of Biola University in my life, and I had no idea you could do a degree in such a thing. And I think I had applied to the program within a week of seeing that magazine ad. So, and the rest is sort of history.
What did you find out when you got there? Were Christianity and science compatible, and what blew your mind? And I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, there's so much I could say about that. I will say I had lots of small awakenings in my first year at Biola, mainly in terms of being introduced to the wide spectrum of understandings of the Genesis creation narrative, the wide spectrum of understandings regarding cosmic evolution, biological evolution, so on and so forth within the Christian community. I thought that everyone who was a Christian had one specific tiny box view about Genesis and how you're supposed to understand creation and all of those things. And so I really came to have a fast and deep appreciation for the diversity and the charity in the conversations among fellow graduate students who came from very different places than I had come from. And learning how to be a scholar, learning how to be charitable towards those with whom you disagree, and learning how to admit when you figure out you're wrong about something and you need to change your mind, and being humble about that. So those.
Did you? Sorry, I keep interjecting because I keep having these questions that I want to ask as you're sharing. I don't normally do that, but I'm excited. Did you find that you encountered the same charity and diversity when you went back to your Baptist roots and you said, hey, I'm learning this? And I mean, I know just from my own faith journey that sometimes you can mention something like maybe you have a different opinion on, whether the 7 days were literal or something, just to name one uncontroversial topic. And it can almost be an anathema, right? For people who are like, no, the Bible said it. I believe it. It happened, period. Right. And so did you encounter some of that? And I'd love to hear some of that process as well, because I think, for somebody like Lizzy, who's been on this podcast and shared, she loves science, she loves math, she loves literal things that she can understand. It's hard for her when she encounters it, like you were saying, you've got different boxes, right? Like, okay, you go to church and go, yeah, Jesus is real, amazing. And then you go to your science class and you're like, wait, this is amazing. And how do you bridge the two when you have other people are saying, wait a second, you can't believe that because it's not congruent with your faith?
I would say I definitely did get some pushback. So by this time in my life, I was late 20s, early 30s while I was doing my graduate degree. And when I would approach, for example, church leadership and say, hey, I'm learning some really cool things in my graduate studies that I think would be tremendously helpful to my fellow congregants. And I'd love to teach a short-term class on creation and the natural sciences. And sometimes that was not well received just in and of itself. And that could be for a myriad of reasons, because I've attended churches where women weren't exactly invited to teach anything ever. But even in churches where female teachers were welcomed, there was hesitation on the part of church leadership, mainly because they understand how controversial these topics can be, and they don't want to rock the boat unnecessarily. And I would argue that these kinds of topics are really important to be able to study within the safety of your home church, so that when you encounter, like I called it, the wide spectrum of views on science and Christianity, then you're not panicking. You're not feeling completely out of your depth like I felt in those early years in the lab. And so I did, but then I also had pastors and other church leaders who were tremendously supportive and did everything they could to equip me to teach and serve the body with the knowledge and giftings that I had been given. So it's a mixed bag. But I'm grateful for it because of course, that kind of adversity, especially within the church, it teaches you so much about charity and, loving your brothers and sisters, even when they do things to frustrate you.
Were there times where you were like, oh man, somebody thinks I'm not a Christian now because I hold this different view on this
No,
topic?
I was never made to feel that way, but there were a couple of occasions when there were two different gentlemen that I attended church with during these years who were, I want to say, 10 to 15 years older than me. And there was definitely an attitude of, I don't want to say superiority necessarily, but this attitude that I would grow out of some of my views eventually.
Yeah.
So.
But you didn't too much because you went on to get your doctorate as well. And now you work for the Discovery Institute. Tell me, and whoever's listening, a little bit more about that. What is the Discovery Institute? I know a little bit about it. I mentioned before we hit record, I remember being an undergraduate at Seattle Pacific University, and someone from the Discovery Institute came and gave a presentation. It was awesome. I bought a book called Darwin's Black Box. It was awesome. But I would love to hear more from you about what it is and what you do there.
So Discovery Institute has been around for several decades now. They really started out as what you could call a think tank about the ideas that they were passionate about, this group of scholars. And they have evolved into something far richer and wonderful than they started out with, and far more impressive and diverse in terms of all of their submissions. But Discovery Institute, if I have to define it in just a few words, is a nonprofit organization deeply committed to human flourishing and cultural renewal. And they operate on the foundational belief that ultimate reality is not simply matter in motion. In other words, materialism is not true. Not only is materialism not true, materialism undermines human flourishing and vibrant human culture. And that's why one of their big projects is what's called the Center for Science and Culture, and that's where I am a fellow. And the Center for Science and Culture is really devoted to all of the questions concerning intelligent design in the natural sciences. So, for example, indicators of design in the universe as a whole, indicators of design in biological life, and so on and so forth. And so I really found my people, I guess you could say, because they're all just as passionate as I am about the intersection of science and the Christian faith, and being on this mission to use the natural sciences as well. Here's a phrase for you: creation revelation. Not many people have heard that phrase before. Many more have heard the phrase natural revelation. And so when they hear creation revelation, they think you're talking about the same thing, but you're really not. When theologians use the phrase natural revelation or natural theology, they're really talking about what the material world reveals about the existence and attributes of God. But when we talk about creation revelation, that's really about investigating God's handiwork to learn about its beauty and its intricacies, how things work, how things are put together. And it's in that realm of creation revelation that we can really just glory in the sciences. Johannes Kepler liked to say that those who study nature are priests in God's grand cosmic temple. And he wasn't the only scientist of his time that used that metaphor, that a scientist is a very special kind of priest. And as they are exegeting the great book of nature, they're learning about the creator of that book of nature. And so they were doing both natural theology and looking at natural revelation, but also just creation revelation. In other words, knowledge of God's creation for its own sake, right? So not necessarily to draw conclusions about the existence of God, although they did love that part, but just to appreciate the artistry and the genius of what God has made. And I don't know. I could just go on and on. I could ramble forever about this topic.
I'm going to keep talking to you. I've got questions. So last year I was at Cross-Examine Instructors Academy, an apologetics conference, and you have to give a presentation and an argument for God's existence. You know, apologetics means to give a defense or a kind argument with respect and gentleness. And my argument was based on beauty. And I was talking about the beauty found in the world. So for the next time that I give that presentation, or for whoever's listening, what is something that you find in the creation revelation or natural revelation that you're like, whoa, gosh, that points to God. That points to a creator. What is something that you just can't get over, that you keep coming back to?
Oh, goodness. Well, I'm a big fan of the manifestation of mathematics in nature. And there are many different ways that this happens, but I am particularly fascinated by geometry in nature. And so things like logarithmic spirals. And I can even show you an example. So this...
I'm not a math person, so you're going to have to break this down like way low. So, like imagine I'm like a third grader.
This is a prehistoric ammonite, and you see the...
Okay. It looks like a snail.
It kind of does, right?
For those who are listening to this.
So you see the spiral in the ammonite shell. It actually adheres very closely to a mathematical logarithm that dictates how the spiral increases in size as it goes. And we see these really cool manifestations of geometry in nature. The first time I was ever exposed to this idea, and maybe this is why it's one of my favorite examples of mathematical beauty made manifest in the physical world, is when I was probably 6 or 7 years old, back in the early 1980s. And we, for the first time ever, had cable TV. So we got to ditch the antenna off the top of the house, and we had cable TV, and we felt very technological. But when you got cable TV, one of the things they did was they gave you a week of free premium channels to try to get you to upgrade and pay for all these extra channels. Well, one of the channels we got for free was Disney. And I just thought this was the greatest thing ever. I could watch Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck any time of day. And there was a short feature film. It was 30 minutes long that would come on from time to time in the rotation. And it was called Donald in Math Magic Land. And it was actually produced in 1959. So it was already decades old by the time I ever saw it. You can watch it for free on YouTube, by the way. And I highly recommend that everyone watch Donald in Math Magic Land. And essentially what the little film does is it demonstrates how mathematics pervades the world. It pervades music, biological life, non-biological aspects of the universe. And it was 1959, so it's not going to have the Hollywood special effects that we have today. But it's just so intriguing and charming. And the wonderful thing about it is, remember, this is Disney in 1959, not Disney today. At the very end of the film, they quote Galileo's famous words about nature being written in the language of mathematics because it is the creation of an all-wise artist. I'm paraphrasing there, but I just think it's so wonderful that it closed with a reference to the creator and using the words of one of our most famous scientists to do it. So anyway, I highly recommend it. It has lots of fun visuals that give demonstrations of what I'm talking about, how we see mathematical and geometrical principles literally come to life in the plant and animal world. It's super fun.
Okay, so Andy Bannister from the UK, I don't know if you know him, but he was on the podcast a couple of years ago, and he was the very first one that I had on the podcast who was talking about math being an apologetic for God, and it blew my mind because I never really thought of it before, and so I was wondering, like, apart from the idea of God or a mind behind all of this, if all you had was naturalism, the Darwinian explanation for all the things, does math being all over our universe and the laws of our world, does that make sense at all? Like, how do you explain that if you don't believe in God? How do people explain that?
So the short answer is the scientific materialists just take it as a brute fact of nature. In other words, they know that their philosophy doesn't provide an explanation for it. And so they just take it as a given and chalk it up to mystery. Or try to say, well, there just isn't an explanation. It's a fact of the world that we just have to accept and brute fact, to use their phrase. But then you...
I was just thinking of like someone I know, like I've heard Lawrence Krauss going on, right? Does he have any good explanation for, it sounds like that's not a great explanation.
No, there is no great explanation. And what's wonderful is that some materialists will even admit this. And one of my favorites is Roger Penrose. He has this thought experiment. Well, not really a thought experiment, but it's this model that he calls the 3 worlds, 3 mysteries problem. I guess you could say this is his pet metaphysical conundrum. And he talks about how we have this eternal world of mathematical truths. And part of this eternal world of mathematical truths maps onto the physical world in such a beautiful, deep, and precise way that we're able to do remarkable things like theoretical physics, particle physics, etc. And then we have this material world that has somehow given rise to minds that can perceive this immaterial world of mathematical truths. And so the cycle goes, and that's why he calls it the 3 worlds, 3 mysteries problem, because he openly admits there is no explanation for why this should be true. But it's this very situation that allows the natural sciences to even exist in the first place. Another good one would be Dr. Max Tegmark at MIT. So he has come to the conclusion that the reason the world manifests so mathematically is that the world literally is merely a grand mathematical object. Okay, so how does an immaterial mathematical object manifest physically? And he doesn't offer any sort of explanation for that, much less an ultimate explanation for the origin of such a thing. Because when we think about mathematical objects, we think, oh, this is a rational construct, right? And where do rational constructs come from? They come from a rational mind. But again, it's just chalked up to this brute fact idea that, oh, there just is this mathematical object that is the universe, period.
Wow. So much of this is over my head, but I'm following you and I love it. And here's my question for you. You're obviously a deep thinker. You think through a lot of things. You ask a lot of questions. Lizzy asks a lot of questions. In fact, some of our conversation was, like she's got endless questions. And it sounds like maybe you could speak to this. Your endless questions have served you well. But at what point do you come to like, okay, God is my authority. And has that always been easy for you? Or have there been times when you've wrestled with, is there really God? Because the more I look into science, I'm struggling with some discrepancies here. Or does your love for science bring you closer to God? I'd love for you to share a little bit about that. I know I just asked like 4 questions in one, but if you'd speak to that, I think that'd be great.
The best way for me to describe it is that the better I understand the nuts and bolts of the natural sciences, and the more I learn about the material world, the more convinced I become of the existence of an omnipotent creator. In fact, I would say that when I've had episodes in my spiritual life when I was struggling, not with the question of God's existence, but there have been times in my 47 years of life when events caused me to struggle with questions of God's goodness and wisdom. It was the study of the natural sciences and seeing his benevolence and artistry in creation. That was my lifeline. And so often you hear people make opposite claims, such as, well, my faith deconstruction began when I started studying the sciences. And I would argue that the reason that happens, if they're telling the truth about the beginning of their deconstruction journey, the reason then that happens is because they're not philosophically astute and they don't realize that the natural sciences depend for their very existence on there being a fundamental mind behind all things, who has created us in his own image such that we have the minds that are equipped to do science. C.S. Lewis made this famous argument called that we now refer to as the argument from reason. And this was a big part of my dissertation research, actually, because it pertained to one of the things Kepler was really getting at when he talked about thinking God's thoughts after him. But Lewis argues that if scientific materialism were true, then we would not be able to rationally argue or rationally believe in its truth because it rules out rationality altogether. In other words, if all that goes on in our heads is matter in motion, chemicals doing what chemicals do according to the laws of nature, then there actually is no such thing as rational thought processes, because we don't have the free will to direct our trains of thought. We don't have the ability to map immaterial laws of good reasoning, the laws of logic, or the laws of mathematics onto the chemical reactions inside of our heads. And so it's just a blind chain reaction. And that is not, by definition, what rational thinking actually is. And I'm oversimplifying that horribly.
Thank you. Thank you for my sake.
But at any rate, the sciences, bottom line is, the sciences could not exist unless mind were the fundamental reality. I just find it remarkable, like the grand success of the scientific enterprise in so many different ways. I mean, if anything shouts the glory of God, it is that. And so it's just remarkable to me that someone could ever think that the sciences somehow undercut Christianity or the case for the existence of God, because I see it as so much the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And real quick, if you wouldn't mind touching on, so it was interesting. I was just watching like a little clip on Instagram. A friend shared it, and it was a video of a psychologist, I think it is. And he was just doing a little reel, and he was saying something about people who see the world differently. And in this case, in his video, it was about someone who's on like a neurodivergent spectrum. And he was saying, like when you look at a microscope and you're looking at, something really detailed, and when you're looking at a telescope and you're looking at the world, you just see things differently. And from a Christian's perspective, we've all been designed differently. The Bible talks about that. We all have, from a scientific standpoint, we all have a unique fingerprint. Isaac Newton said, in the absence of anything else, the thumb alone would make him believe in the existence of God, right? So, we are uniquely designed to see the world differently. And one of the things that Lizzy and I talked about in that first conversation, she just said, I ask all these questions, and she talked a little bit about this feeling like, I wish I was different, in comparison. But you wouldn't be able to do what you do if you weren't somebody who asked a lot of questions. Am I right on that? And would you speak a little bit to that? Because we all struggle with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think inquisitiveness, curiosity are hallmarks of what it means to be made in God's image, such that we could, by the creation mandate, have authority and dominion and cultivate creation. I am convinced that if the fall had never happened, and of course this is a thought experiment, but if the fall had never happened, then Adam and Eve and their descendants would have enjoyed a life of continual questioning and learning. And I can't, if we believe that all truth is God's truth, then any heartfelt, genuine question about any aspect of reality is in its own way honoring to the Lord, because we are seeking to understand what he has made. We're seeking to understand the human condition, and we can trust that there are really good reasons, really good answers for all of these questions that we have. But on this side of eternity, we may not get every answer. And I think that's something that we all have to live in the tension of, you know what I mean? But I think inquisitiveness and curiosity are virtues rather than failings. And I believe that the Lord honors our desire to just learn and learn and learn and learn.
Yeah. How do you, as somebody who does ask a lot of questions, find satisfaction in the things that you don't know and the things that are still open-ended, right? Where do you find that rest? That rest from, because curiosity is wonderful, but at a certain point, we just need to step back and go, okay, I'm going to trust you in this. And one of the things that Lizzy and I talked a little bit about was that difficulty in trusting. So how do you trust that God's got the answers and you're not going to go find it in Darwin or, Lawrence Krauss or whoever else? Like, no, I'm going to trust that God has the answers on this one. Would you speak just a little bit to that? I don't have a ton of, I've got 2 more questions that I'd love to ask you, but I'd love to address this real quick.
Okay. So if I understand you correctly, you're asking me, what do we do? How do we have peace of mind, spiritual peace, when we have these open questions and answers don't really seem to be forthcoming? I guess I've been a passionate learner for so long that I have a degree of acceptance of mystery that maybe some other people haven't quite gotten to, for lack of a better way to put it. And so open questions, while sometimes I can get frustrated with not having an answer to every single thing, I also am not troubled by the fact that on this side of eternity, there are things I may never know. And that's okay. I'm just not, I'm not spiritually troubled by that because I understand my finitude as a creature. And, when it comes to unresolved tensions between scientific theories and core doctrines of Christianity, I think those are extremely few and far between, contrary to public perception. But when there is one, and I'm not even going to try to name one, let's just leave it.
Let's talk real quickly. Actually, that was my next question. The Big Bang Theory. Lizzy actually gave a great apologetic for it. I would probably give something very similar to what she said, but I'd love for you to address that specifically because it's something that comes up all the time. Like, oh, I don't believe in the Big Bang, right? So would you mind just touching on that?
Yeah, sure. So the slogan that you see quite frequently, I actually grew up seeing this, was either God did it or the Big Bang did it, and I believe in God, or it'll have like a Bible verse or something like Genesis 1:1 or something, and I think that that's a categorical mistake, and by that I mean the Big Bang is not a cause. The Big Bang is an event. It is an effect of a cause. And so to try to say it was either God or the Big Bang is to just confuse the categories. So Big Bang cosmology, one of the best supported scientific theories we have to date, is wonderfully supportive of the Christian doctrine of an ultimate beginning and the necessity of an ultimate cause that transcends the material, a cause that itself is immaterial and eternal and all powerful. And so the Big Bang is one of the best things ever. Big Bang Theory is one of the best things ever to happen to arguments for the existence of God, in my view. And so I wish, and of course I'm on a mission to help more people understand that this is not something to shy away from or to have fear of, because it's beautifully supportive of a cosmic creator.
Well, wasn't Albert Einstein and his contemporaries, didn't they wait quite a while before adopting that theory because it was too much like a deity? It sounded too much like, wait a second, if there was a beginning, there has to be something eternal behind it.
When Einstein developed his general theory of relativity, one of the implications of his equations was that the universe was not static. In other words, it's not just this unchanging entity, that it's either shrinking or expanding. So if you think about fast forwarding or rewinding that scenario, you end up with unsettling consequences, right? And he understood that. He found it extremely distasteful. And so he introduced a mathematical fudge factor into his mathematical theory to achieve a theory that would suggest a static universe. Well, then we have two other scientists independently, Alexander Friedman and George Lemaitre, finding solutions to Einstein's relativity equations that suggested an expanding universe. So George Lemaitre, who was actually a Catholic priest, developed something that came to be called the primeval atom theory. And it was very much an early rudimentary form of our contemporary Big Bang theory. This idea that at some finite point in the past, the universe sprang into existence from what we now call this singularity. And he and Einstein had conversations about this. And Einstein at one point is recorded as having said, no, I just can't accept this. how does he word it? I can't accept this. It implies too much a creation. Mm-hmm. So it took gaining the empirical evidence gathered by the famous Edwin Hubble and his giant telescope that finally convinced Einstein that he was wrong and that he had to accept a universe with a finite past, a universe that had come into existence. And then from there, Big Bang Theory has just further developed and gained further empirical support. And I'd love to know what he'd say today, actually. But as time has gone on, there have been other scientists who tried very, very hard to develop other cosmological models that could get us away from this idea of an ultimate beginning. For example, the one that's probably best known is called steady state theory. And this was something that the famous Sir Fred Hoyle worked on. And he's actually the one who coined the term Big Bang, actually. And he was not a fan. He was not a fan of Big Bang Theory.
It's a joke, right? Wasn't it? Like, I'm going to call it a joke, your Big Bang Theory.
Yeah. So this just goes to show you that this idea not suggested, but this inescapable idea of an original cause of all matter, space, and even time itself has strong theological implications, positive theological implications. And scientists working in these areas recognize that and try to circumvent it and have not yet successfully done so. And then we could get into the whole philosophical side of the argument about how you can't really have an infinite past series of events or an infinite past series of moments in time. And what do you do with that? There had to have been a start somewhere, and so on and so forth. So we have science and philosophy and theology all working beautifully together in this grand orchestration that points very strongly towards the existence of a creator.
That's right. So if you're a Christian watching this, and first of all, if you're not a Christian, amazing that all points to God. But also, if you are a Christian, I just highly recommend, there's a great book, I recommended it to Lizzy, is Atheism Dead? Or I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. The first one's written by Eric Metaxas, the second one by Norman Geisler and Frank Turek, both amazing books. Read them, and then next time you're talking to someone and they say, hey, I believe in the Big Bang Theory, say, great, I do too. And I just believed that there was a big banger. So anyway, I stole that line from Frank Turek. You've heard it before, I'm sure. Melissa, this has been wonderful. I need to have you on again because this has been fantastic. And I have so many questions that we didn't get to, but I always ask the same final question of our guests, and I want to make sure I ask you. And I did not give you this one ahead of time because I always like to, just throw people on the spot. And I've done that enough today as well. So, but the Finding Something Real podcast, it's about a journey towards finding something real. Real is an acronym for restoration, eternity, authenticity, and love. All things that as believers in Christ, we believe are ultimately found in relationship with Him. Restoration, eternity, authenticity, and love. Which of those things stands out to you the most in your life right now, and why?
Oh, goodness. You said the R is restoration.
Yeah.
That strikes a deep chord with me in this season of my life. I mentioned earlier that when I have had spiritual struggles, those were not concerning the existence of God or the truth of Christianity in general, but were often struggles related to very difficult seasons of life. And I would say that the past 5 years have not been a continual season of struggle of that type, but have involved a lot of individual struggles. And it has just been maybe in the past 6 months or so that I've sensed such a remarkable sense of restoration from the Lord. And it's one of those things that in hindsight, you see him at work, even in the hard things. But now coming into a season of feeling that a lot that felt so broken now feels so beautifully restored. And so that's the one that stands out most to me, restoration.
I love that. If people want to find you later, they can go to your website. Is it melissacaintravis.com?
That's right.
Is that right? Wonderful. And you can look up the Discovery Institute. We'll link both of those in the show notes. Melissa, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, sharing. I just love this conversation. I just think you're wonderful. And we're going to have you back on if you agree to it. Anyway, thank you so much. Until next time.
Thank you. This was so much fun. And I look forward to talking again.